They say Donald Trump could divide a room just by walking into it. But I never thought he'd be the reason my marriage went down in flames. Yeah, you heard me right. I blame Donald Trump for the fact that my wife cheated on me. It sounds insane, doesn't it? But stick with me because this mess is as American as it gets. November 5th, 2024, in the heat of a brutal election season, my wife, Nadia, was drawn to the polling stations like a moth to a flame. She was fired up, ready to do her part, as she put it, and throw herself into the chaos of a historic election. At first, I admired her passion. Who wouldn't want a partner committed to civic duty? But Trump had changed the game. His comeback stirred something raw and reckless in people, and apparently in her. In the end, all that talk about duty and keeping democracy safe turned out to be nothing more than a cover. While the rest of the country was battling over ballots, Nadia was getting swept up in her own private drama at the polling station. Turns out, the pull of Trump's New America wasn't just about votes. It was about breaking rules, tearing down boundaries, feeding on chaos. And she bought into it all the way. I didn't know it yet, but Trump's election wasn't the only thing that would blow up that week. By the time the votes were counted, my marriage was done. Just a few days ago, life was comfortably routine for me and Nadia. We were that typical suburban couple, complete with the 2 kids, a 3-bedroom home in Pennsylvania, and a calm, almost unshakable existence we'd spent over a decade building. We had our ups and downs, of course. I worked as a project manager in the city, and Nadia had taken a break from teaching to be more involved with the kids. Our daughter, Lena, was 12, and our son, Max, had just turned 9. Nadia was the steady, reliable sort, the kind who'd volunteer to bring snacks for every school event, who'd organize the yearly Thanksgiving dinner, and who had even become the head of the PDA. But the one thing that really excited her lately? Volunteering at the polls for the upcoming presidential election. With Donald Trump and Kamala Harris head-to-head in a brutal 2024 showdown, she felt it was a civic duty to contribute in some small way. Election day rolled around, and as she headed out early in the morning, I watched her a bit amused. I teased her about becoming the neighborhood's political hero, but she just laughed, brushing me off like it was no big deal. Yet there was something different in her demeanor that day. She dressed up a little more than usual, makeup meticulously done, even spritzed on her favorite perfume. She looked sharp, sure, but the casualness of her "it's just another day" excuse didn't sit right with me. Still, I figured, who wouldn't want to make a good impression? By late afternoon, I was swamped with work calls and barely registered the time. It wasn't until the sun started dipping that I noticed how quiet the house felt without her usual presence. I checked my watch. She should have been home by now. A quick text went unanswered. I brushed it off, though. Polls can get crazy, I thought. But as the evening slipped into night, with no word from her, an uneasy feeling started gnawing at me. Nadia's involvement in the election went deeper than just a casual civic duty. For her, volunteering at the polling station wasn't about clocking in some good citizen points. It was personal. She'd been increasingly passionate about the state of the country over the past few years, especially as politics grew more divisive. Our household had always leaned Democratic, and Nadia, like many of our friends, had supported Joe Biden when he was elected in 2020. But by 2024, she was frustrated. Biden's presidency, while steady and focused on rebuilding post-pandemic America, had faced fierce resistance from Republicans at every turn. Under Biden, the Democrats had managed to make some progress. Healthcare reforms, climate initiatives, and a push for a fairer economy. But it felt like every step forward triggered an intense backlash. Social media had turned into a virtual battleground, with everyone from our local librarian to people in line at the grocery store squaring off over immigration, inflation, and just about every policy Biden's administration touched. This was the context for Nadia's fervor. With Trump re-entering the scene and Kamala Harris on the Democratic ticket, this election was historic, almost like a final showdown. Trump's decision to run again had reignited everything his previous campaign embodied. To his supporters, he was the voice of traditional American values, standing up to woke liberalism, and calling out what he saw as the Democrats' failure to address the economic struggles of real Americans. But to people like Nadia, he was a threat, representing everything divisive and dangerous in the political landscape, a figure who seemed to give permission to conspiracy theories and the erosion of norms. The months leading up to Election Day were filled with rallies, with each candidate drawing huge crowds. Kamala Harris, fiercely articulate, held her ground, especially in swing states, pulling in voters who saw her as a modern face of hope and resilience. But Trump's campaign machine was relentless, with slogans like "Make America Great Again," for real this time, dominating media feeds. His supporters were as loud as ever, gathering for massive rallies, some of which erupted into clashes with counter-protesters, and the tension on both sides was palpable. By the time the election came around, it wasn't just about policies, it was personal. Every debate between Harris and Trump was a confrontation in itself. Harris pushed back on Trump's critiques of Biden's administration with a sharpness that cut through the noise. Trump, in his characteristic style, dismissed her as part of a corrupt system that had only worsened life for Americans, tapping into the frustrations of people who felt left behind. Harris, in turn, challenged Trump's ethics, his statements on democracy, and his attacks on the very institutions that held the country together. Each exchange was reported like it was the front line of a battlefield. In our town and across Pennsylvania, a critical swing state, the election felt less like voting day and more like a flashpoint. By the time Nadia signed up to work the polls, stories of aggressive confrontations between Democrats and Republicans at early voting locations had already made the rounds on local news. Polling stations across the state were prepared for crowds and even potential clashes, with volunteers warned to expect high emotions. For Nadia, stepping into that polling station wasn't just about helping run an election. It was a way to defend what she felt was right. She wanted to ensure everything ran smoothly and that people's voices were heard fairly, even amid the noise of this divided nation. But looking back, I wonder if there was something else there too. Maybe it was the thrill of being a part of history or a chance to engage with a cause that had become so important to her, maybe even at the expense of other things she valued, like our family. As the days rolled on, Nadia's dedication to her polling station duties started feeling strange, even obsessive. It wasn't just that she was working longer shifts than I thought were necessary for a volunteer position. It was the way she came home every night. Exhausted, yes, but with a certain jittery energy. She'd walk through the door, eyes darting around as if she'd just been through a war zone, throw a quick, distracted smile my way, and brush off any questions with the same rehearsed line. "It's fine, just long hours." At first, I took her word for it. Election day had come and gone, but with such a close race between Trump and Harris, vote counting was still ongoing, and many polling stations had extended hours to handle the flood of ballots. But even then, it felt like her commitment went way beyond what I'd expect from a volunteer. There were late-night meetings, shifts that didn't seem to line up with anything other poll workers were doing. Every night she'd return well past midnight, looking worn out, with a faint smell of coffee and, oddly enough, perfume that didn't quite smell like hers. She'd stopped talking much about the election itself, which was odd. Nadia was usually an open book, especially when it came to politics. In past years, she kept me updated on every issue, but now, she clammed up. The one time I tried to ask about what was keeping her so late, she waved it off with a weak smile. "You know how it is," she'd said. "Just a lot of eyes on this election. People get tense." But she wasn't just tense. She seemed downright anxious. When I pressed her, she'd avoid my eyes, acting as though I were asking about the weather instead of the hours she was missing from home. The change wasn't just in her behavior. Small details started to stand out, like the way she kept her phone almost glued to her. Normally, Nadia would leave her phone on the counter, somewhere in plain sight, but now it never left her side. If she got a message, she'd excuse herself and step into another room, returning only when she was done typing. Then there were the excuses. A late meeting with the team here, a last-minute recount request there. It was getting harder to swallow, especially since none of her co-workers I'd met before the election seemed anywhere near as stressed or elusive as she was. And, almost like clockwork, whenever I asked more than one or two questions, she'd grow defensive, as if I were accusing her of something serious. "It's fine," she'd repeat, more to herself than to me. "It's just a lot of responsibility. Everything has to be done right." But after a week of odd hours and vague explanations, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. There was a new tension between us, one she couldn't fully mask, and it lingered in every evasive smile, every half-hearted kiss goodnight. The election finally ended in a seismic shock. Trump won. But I didn't know any of that yet. The results were still coming in, with Pennsylvania holding everyone's breath the entire state teetering on the edge of a historic decision. Nadia, meanwhile, was still wrapped up in her pole duties, vanishing for late-night shifts, checking her phone more obsessively, and coming home even more on edge. I kept telling myself this intensity would soon pass, that she was only caught up in the madness of the moment. Yet my patience was thinning. The whole household was feeling it. The kids noticing her distance, her distracted looks. When she was home, she was there in body but absent in spirit. She was somewhere else entirely. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong, and it gnawed at me until I started avoiding eye contact myself. But then, things took a turn that I could never have expected. It happened on a Thursday night. I'd barely gotten to sleep when Nadia's phone buzzed. She was in the shower, so I reached over to turn it off, only to see a message flash across her screen. Tonight's shift is getting a little complicated. It was from a number I didn't recognize, but something about the wording sent a chill down my spine. I had no idea at the time, but at that exact moment, somewhere across town, a group of election officials was having an emergency meeting over some unexpected footage found on one of the surveillance cameras set up to monitor ballot handling. It seemed that security footage from one of the polling locations had captured something unusual, a scene far outside of protocol. The footage revealed Nadia in one of the back rooms of the polling station with another worker, a guy I vaguely remembered seeing with her once or twice in the past week. He was younger, tall, with a sly look that radiated trouble. In the grainy footage, they were laughing, talking closely, and then it escalated. The two of them leaned in, lips meeting in a hurried, forbidden kiss. It was as if the high tension of the election, the long hours, the secrecy, the stakes, had pushed them past some invisible line. It didn't stop there. They moved quickly, frantically, as if even the walls of the polling station weren't enough to contain them. The footage showed them disappearing into a corner, hands tangled in each other's clothes. It was raw, impulsive, and left no room for doubt about what was happening. The controllers who discovered it were stunned, and of course alarmed. This wasn't just scandalous, it was risky. A breach like this during such a critical election could spark a media frenzy, not to mention the potential for accusations of tampered ballots or compromised results. Back home, the tension only grew. I couldn't reach Nadia that night, and she didn't return until the next morning. She walked in quietly, setting down her bag like it was a normal Friday, except this time, she didn't even try to look me in the eyes. I knew something had to give. Just as Pennsylvania's election dust began to settle, rumors started swirling around the local polling stations. Word had it that an internal investigation was underway and that several volunteers, including my wife, were facing potential disciplinary action for misconduct. The news was only a faint whisper in the community, the kind of low, quiet talk that no one wanted to confirm out loud. But the local election board wasn't taking it lightly. It turned out that one of the security officers responsible for monitoring polling locations had stumbled upon the footage by chance. He'd been reviewing the night shifts, doing a spot check on ballot handling procedures. When he found it, Nadia and her co-worker caught red-handed in the midst of their little escapade. It wasn't long before it reached the higher-ups, who couldn't ignore the breach. For a volunteer to be involved in anything even remotely scandalous during an election like this was explosive. The election authorities were quick to act, calling an emergency meeting with their legal advisors. They had to figure out their options, and fast. With Pennsylvania's results in the national spotlight, this incident wasn't just a small-town scandal. It was a potential PR nightmare. If word leaked, people would question the integrity of the entire local election process. Trump's one was already polarizing enough. The last thing they needed was an affair scandal tied to the election staff. They couldn't risk anyone thinking the results had been compromised by distracted or compromised workers. The next day, Nadia's phone buzzed with an official email from the election board. The language was firm, almost cold, and it struck me even as I read it over her shoulder. They were summoning her and her co-worker to a hearing, citing inappropriate conduct in a sensitive environment, and warning of potential legal repercussions if it was determined that any protocols had been breached. Even if she'd simply violated workplace rules, the consequences could be severe. She was risking her reputation, not to mention potential criminal charges if the board decided to press the issue. Nadia's face went pale as she read the email, hands trembling slightly. I asked her what was going on, if something had happened. Her face hardened, and she brushed it off, mumbling something about workplace politics and overreacting supervisors. But this time, I wasn't buying it. Nadia, what's going on? I pressed, my voice firmer than I'd intended. What could possibly be so serious that they're talking about disciplinary action? She took a deep breath, clearly fighting to keep her composure. But I could see the weight of her mounting stress breaking through the surface. It's nothing, just some misunderstanding, she replied a little too quickly. They're just trying to make a show of being thorough. I didn't do anything wrong. Her words rang hollow, and I felt a chill of suspicion creeping in. A misunderstanding wouldn't bring her superiors down on her like this. Yet, she refused to say more, deflecting each of my questions as if I were a nosy stranger and not her husband of 15 years. In the silence that followed, I realized that my trust in her was hanging by a thread. Something had happened in those polling station halls, something she wasn't telling me, and whatever it was about to destroy everything we had built. When the news broke, it spread like wildfire. Local journalists couldn't resist the story. A scandal right in the heart of a historic election, involving 2 polling station workers in a flagrant breach of conduct. It was all over social media, rumors mixing with fact, fueling speculation and turning the whole mess into public gossip. The headlines didn't name names, but it wasn't hard to figure out who was involved. Nadia's misconduct was practically the only topic anyone cared about. It was only a matter of time before friends, neighbors, even people at the kids' school started giving me those sympathetic looks. Their glances lingered a little too long, as if they knew something I didn't. My phone was buzzing constantly, friends checking in, pretending to care when I knew they just wanted the details. The weight of it all finally became unbearable one evening. She'd come home late, her eyes bloodshot and tired, her face drawn with stress and something else, something closer to shame. I decided I'd had enough of pretending that everything was okay. Nadia, sit down, I said, my voice cold, unfamiliar even to myself. She hesitated, her eyes flicking nervously to the kids' bedroom door. The house was quiet. The kids were already asleep. She lowered herself onto the couch across from me, avoiding my gaze. What's going on? She muttered, trying to sound annoyed, but there was a tremor in her voice. You know exactly what's going on, I replied, barely containing the anger simmering beneath the surface. The whole town knows, Nadia. People are talking about it on Facebook, in the grocery store. Hell, even my boss asked me if I was doing okay today. Her face paled, but she stayed silent, staring at her hands. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a whisper, dangerously calm. Are you really going to make me say it? After a long pause, she looked up, her face tight with resignation. Fine, she said, her voice barely audible. I messed up. Those words were like a punch to the gut, but I pushed forward. Messed up? Is that what you call sneaking around with some guy in a polling station while our kids are at home, while I'm here wondering why my wife has been so distant? Her face twisted, a mixture of shame and defiance. It wasn't like that, she muttered. It was, I don't know, okay? I didn't plan it. It just happened. That's your excuse? I snapped. You didn't plan it? Do you have any idea what this looks like? Not just for us, but for our family, for our kids. She flinched at the mention of the kids, finally meeting my eyes. I know, she whispered, her voice breaking. I know I've hurt you. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It's just with everything going on, the stress, the pressure. I wasn't thinking. You weren't thinking? I repeated, the words tasting bitter. Did you ever stop to think about what this would do to us? To the life we've built? Or were you just so caught up in your civic duty that you decided our marriage didn't matter? Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't feel any sympathy. Not now. Not after what she'd done. I thought about our kids sleeping just down the hall, blissfully unaware that the foundation of their family was crumbling beneath them. I thought about the countless nights I'd stayed up, worrying over her late hours, trusting her. You were supposed to be my partner, I said quietly, my voice barely a whisper. We built this life together. You wanted this family just as much as I did. And now, you've thrown it all away for what? A thrill? An escape? She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. Please, I don't know how to explain it, she choked out. I was lost, okay? It was a mistake, and I'm sorry. A mistake? I repeated, my voice growing colder. A mistake is leaving the stove on. This was a choice. You chose to betray me, and you chose to risk everything we have. There was nothing more to say. The damage was done, and no amount of apologies would make it go away. We sat in silence, a chasm of betrayal between us, both of us knowing that things would never be the same. After the scandal went public, the fallout hit us like a hurricane. Nadia's face was everywhere, in social media posts, whispered conversations, even in the local newspaper's anonymous sources section, which ran a vague but unmistakable article about inappropriate conduct at a polling station involving a married volunteer. Her name wasn't mentioned, but it didn't need to be. In a town like ours, everyone already knew. The news spread quickly among her friends and colleagues. Some of her friends reached out to her at first, feigning concern, but the calls grew fewer and fewer as the gossip tightened around her like a noose. Her phone went from constant buzzing to dead silence within days. Her best friend, Erica, who she'd known since college, was suddenly too busy to return her texts. The PTA moms, who used to rely on her for organizing everything from bake sales to field trips, politely avoided her at school events. Even the neighbors stopped waving hello. But the worst of it hit when she was called into her main job's office. Nadia was an elementary school teacher, and though her affair had nothing to do with the school, the administration felt the need to protect the integrity of their institution. She came home that day pale as a ghost, eyes hollow as she walked through the door. Without a word, she handed me the letter they'd given her. She was suspended pending further review, which we both knew was just a polite preamble to being fired. Losing her job sent her into a spiral. For years, she'd been a respected teacher, known for her dedication and kindness. Parents trusted her, and kids adored her. Now, with a few reckless choices, all of that was gone. Every time she tried to make it up to the school, she'd run into cold faces and averted gazes. The weight of shame was written all over her, and every time we went out, people would whisper as we passed, their eyes sliding over her with a mix of pity and disdain. Our relationship became a ghost of what it once was. I could barely look at her without feeling the sting of betrayal. Nights were the worst, lying in bed next to a stranger who had once been my wife, trying to make sense of how we'd ended up here. We'd once been inseparable. Now, an invisible wall divided us, built from all the secrets, lies, and reckless decisions she'd made. The kids were starting to pick up on it too. Our strained conversations, the tense silences that filled the house. Lena, our daughter, started avoiding her mom, sensing that something was wrong, but too afraid to ask. One evening, Nadia tried to apologize again, her voice cracking as she told me she'd never meant to hurt me, to hurt us. But I couldn't take her words seriously anymore. I was numb, replaying the betrayal in my mind like a bad movie, every detail crystal clear. "Do you think sorry is going to fix this?" I asked, the anger and frustration spilling over in a low, bitter tone. "Do you have any idea what you've done to us? To me? To the kids?" She couldn't answer, just sat there, her face what with silent tears. For a brief moment, I almost felt a pang of sympathy. But then I remembered the months of lies, the way she'd come home smelling like someone else, the way she'd look me in the eye and pretended everything was fine. I made the hardest decision of my life, to end the marriage. It wasn't a decision I reached lightly. 15 years of memories, 2 kids, and a lifetime's worth of shared dreams didn't just disappear. But there was no way around it. No matter how much I might have wanted to salvage what we'd built, staying together would mean sacrificing my self-respect and, eventually, the stability our family desperately needed. When I told Nadia, she broke down. She tried to plead, to bargain, to promise anything if I just give her another chance. She was willing to go to therapy, to change, to rebuild. But I knew those were just words. Even if she meant them, I'd never be able to look at her the same way. The trust was gone, and with it, the foundation of our marriage. All I could think of was the weight of the lies she'd lived with so easily, the betrayal that had stolen our family's peace, and the damage that couldn't be undone. "I can't do this, Nadia," I told her, my voice hollow. "What you did had shattered everything we had. I can't pretend it never happened, and I can't make myself forget." She sat there, her face crumpling as she tried to hold back sobs. "But we can work through this. We have to try for the kids, for us. Don't throw it all away." But it was already gone. I realized then that sometimes love isn't enough to save what's been broken beyond repair. I moved into the guest room that night. It was a small act, but it was the first step toward reclaiming a sense of dignity and self-worth. As I lay there, Staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, I felt an emptiness that stretched deeper than anything I'd known. It was like grieving a death, except the person wasn't gone. She was just down the hall, someone I could no longer trust, someone who'd chosen a fleeting thrill over the life we'd built together. Breaking the news to our kids was agonizing. Lena, who was 12, understood more than I'd expected. She sat there, quiet, her face crumpling with a look of disbelief and betrayal that mirrored my own. Max, at 9, didn't fully grasp the gravity of what was happening, but he clung to me, asking over and over, "Is it going to be okay?" I reassured him as best as I could, my heart breaking as I promised that he and Lena would be safe, that they'd always have both of us, even if we weren't together. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. New cheating wife stories tomorrow.